Today is October 19th, 2023. I want to continue covering the situation in Ukraine as well as the escalating violence in the Middle East between Israel and the Palestinians. Let's start with Ukraine. Let's look at liveuamap.com. It is a pro-Ukrainian live map, so keep that in mind when we look at it. We look along the line of contact. Just as I pointed out in my previous update, the initiative is shifting to Russia. The Ukrainian offensive over the last 4+ months has culminated. The initiative is shifting over to Russia. They are putting pressure all along the line of contact. They have been conducting major operations around Avdiivka. I just want to point out that this narrative that we hear in the Western media and from Ukraine of Ukrainian forces defeating a Russian blitzkrieg, this is for public consumption only. This was not a Russian blitzkrieg. It was not a major Russian offensive. These were operations to improve Russia's position around Avdiivka. Eventually, they will encircle and take Avdiivka. It's heavily fortified. This will be a process that unfolds over the matter of months, not days, certainly not weeks. This is how Russia has conducted all of its operations throughout the entire special military operation. They are leveraging their massive advantage in artillery, military aviation, the fact that they have so much ammunition, that they're able to produce so much ammunition versus Ukraine and its Western sponsors. This allows them to sit back and degrade Ukrainian defenses over time and only storming Ukrainian positions when those defenses have been sufficiently weakened. So we keep hearing about Russian offensive potential, and we look at operations around Avdiivka or Vuhledar last year during the winter, and we keep hearing people talk about how Russia isn't able to carry out these big arrow offensives that the West and Ukraine imagined the Ukrainian offensive resembling, which are fashioned off of the United States steamrolling over the Iraqi army. That cannot happen in Ukraine. Neither side is capable of this. It's not because Russia is incompetent or their weapons are incapable. It is the nature of modern warfare. If two sides possess significant numbers of mines, artillery, anti-tank weapons, storming a heavily fortified position will be difficult. Doesn't matter whether you have artillery, armor, military aviation or not, it will be difficult. Of course, if you don't have it, it'll be even more difficult. Let's talk about ATACMS, these ballistic missiles that the US had been talking about for many months sending Ukraine. Very recently, there was some indecision in the White House about whether or not they would send them. There were some announcements claiming that they would, others claiming that they wouldn't. At that time, I assumed that the US sent ATACMS so that we would see them on the battlefield at any time. And now they've appeared. So we have this article from the New York Times. Ukraine uses powerful American-supplied missiles for first time. Ukrainian forces attacked 2 key Russian air bases behind enemy lines using American-made long-range missiles known as ATACMS, a U.S. official said. Ukraine used the missiles called ATACMS to strike 2 air bases in Russian-controlled territory, according to an American official familiar with the assault. Ukraine's Special Operations Forces said the attack damaged runways and destroyed 9 helicopters, an ammunition depot, an anti-aircraft missile launcher, and military equipment. Those claims could not be independently verified, and anything the Ukrainian government says should be taken with great skepticism. It also says it is unclear how much of a difference the missile system will make on the battlefield. Other Western-provided weapons, including tanks, have provided only a marginal advantage in a war that has bogged down for months. Did Western tanks provide even a marginal advantage? I would say no. It also says the version of the missile sent by the United States, the last major system Ukraine had sought from the United States, is limited in range still. Officials said that it was sufficient to reach almost all of the main bases that Russia has used for air support and for supplying their troops in Ukraine. And then it talks about the number of the missiles sent and the supposedly covert nature they were sent, with which they were sent. After many reports that a decision had been made to supply the weapons, their delivery was carried out in secrecy, out of concern that they could be attacked by Russia as they were shipped into the country. In addition, Ukraine wanted to try to catch the Russians off guard. Two Western officials said the United States had sent about 20 of the missiles to Ukraine. If it is actually only 20 missiles, this is even less than insignificant. This is absolutely meaningless. We have an article by The Drive here. Destruction from Ukraine's first ATACMS strike now apparent. They're showing these satellite images. They're looking at these scorch marks on tarmac. It says satellite imagery from Planet Labs taken earlier today shows at least 9 distinct scorch marks, most with wreckage also visible along the main runway and adjacent taxiways at the eastern ends of Berdyansk Airport. The locations of the scorch marks wreckage are also consistent with where Russian helicopters are seen parked. In earlier imagery in Planet Labs database, they mentioned that there were a variety of helicopters there, so they're not certain what type of helicopters were destroyed. They also call into question some of these Ukrainian claims of all of this other equipment they said they destroyed. They say they don't see any evidence of that in the satellite images. The ATACMS used are the shorter range cluster warhead variants. Here is a video of a test launch. You can see it taking off. And then you can see as it approaches the ground, it releases these bomblets just above the ground. And you can imagine how much damage that would cause to especially aircraft out in the open. They claim 9 helicopters were hit. Again, they're not sure which type, but I'd just like to point out that Russia manufactures hundreds of helicopters every single year. They have over 100 of each attack helicopter variant that they're using. And so 9 helicopters out of this arsenal and this production capacity of Russia really isn't going to make a difference unless Ukraine can do this on a regular basis. But if they've only gotten 20 missiles and the US isn't sending any more, I don't see how that is even possible. We saw especially the Ka-52 attack helicopters playing a key role in destroying huge amounts of Ukrainian armor during Ukraine's offensive. And I don't recall hearing about many Ka-52s being shot down. They were using newer, longer range missiles that put them well out of range of man-portable air defense systems, and Ukraine's air defense capabilities in general have been so degraded that they were not really able to protect their forces in the way I think they would have liked to have done. And again, even the New York Times sounds skeptical over whether or not these missiles are going to make a difference. I want to point out something that Mark Sloboda said in a recent interview that he gave. All the Russians had to do was put these helicopters into hardened shelters. These hardened shelters almost certainly would have protected them from this variant of the ATACMS missile. Even if they had the other unitary warhead version, it would have destroyed one of these bunkers. The other bunkers would have protected the helicopters inside. They could have also dispersed their helicopters. Instead of having them all at one airbase, you would divide them up in a number of locations, making it very difficult for Ukraine to carry out a strike like this. You force Ukraine to spread their missiles out over a wider distance. It gives Russian air defense more opportunities to intercept them. When they launch all of these missiles at one location, it allows them to saturate Russian air defense capabilities. For Russia's part, they claim that they've downed at least half of these ATACMS launched, and that shouldn't surprise anyone. Even the West, Western analysts admit that Russia has some of the best air defense capabilities in the world. They certainly have a lot of air defense systems, and they have been successfully downing all other long-range weapons that the US and its allies have passed over to Ukraine at very high rates. Again, making these long-range weapons being sent to Ukraine not ineffective, but not capable of changing the situation on the battlefield strategically. I've also pointed out that if the ATACMS were this war-winning capability that so many pro-Ukrainian commentators seem to think, Russia will win first because they have the Iskander missile system. It fires 2 missiles for each launcher. Further than the ATACMS, even the longest range ATACMS, the longest range ATACMS has a range of 300 kilometers. Iskander has a range of 500 kilometers. And the Russian Iskander system has 2 variants, a ballistic missile version like the ATACMS and also a cruise missile version. They have many more of these launchers and many, many more of these missiles. They certainly have many more missiles than 20. So we will have to sit through another wonder weapon narrative arc where the first attack is hailed a massive success, on the verge of tipping the balance back into Ukraine's favor. But then Russia adapts. They're able to intercept these. They're able to disperse or protect, harden the potential targets of these missiles. They're able to jam them, as they've been jamming the guided rockets that the HIMARS and M270 launchers fire. The HIMARS and M270 launchers are what also fire the ATACMS missiles. And this is actually what happened to the guided rockets fired by the HIMARS. They have a shorter range. They were supposed to be a stand-in for Ukraine's lack of military aviation. They could carry out long-range strikes on logistics, storage, ammunition depots, command and control. They were supposed to be able to hit all of this. Russia dispersed all of this, moved it back out of range. They're going to do the exact same thing with these ATACMS missiles. And what HIMARS has been reduced to is counter battery fire, which it does very well, but it's a very expensive way to do counter battery radar, and also inefficient. If you only have a small number of launchers and you're only able to launch, say, 18 rockets per day, this is going to seriously impede your counter battery efforts. So this is the latest on Ukraine. Let's turn to Israel. And as a matter of fact, Live UA Map has a version of the live map for Israel. Let's take a look at it. So you can see Israel here. And if you zoom in, you can see the West Bank, or what's left of it. And then if you zoom in real close, you can see Gaza. You can see how small Gaza is. It is incredibly small. And this blue area, this is very important because I'm going to be talking about northern Gaza in just a moment. Israel has indicated they want to carry out ground operations here in northern Gaza, and I surmise they are looking at only northern Gaza because it is untenable to attempt a ground operation to encompass all of Gaza, at least at this juncture. I think everyone has heard about the Al Ali Baptist Hospital strike. Israel is claiming that it was a misfired Hamas rocket. It was almost certainly an Israeli bomb. There's absolutely nothing in Hamas's arsenal that is capable of this level of destruction. And I just want people to ask themselves if they are prone to believing what Israel is claiming here. Look around at the hundreds, if not thousands, of rockets Hamas has launched just recently. Show me one example of a building that suffered this level of destruction anywhere in Israel. Show me. You can't show me because it doesn't exist, because Hamas does not have a weapon capable of this level of destruction. The vast majority of the Israelis killed so far were killed during the Hamas raids. They went in there on the ground with guns, with heavy weapons, and they were killing Israelis. This was not done with their rockets. So let's look at this a little further. Even before the bombing of this hospital, Israel demanded all hospitals be evacuated. And For people who ever moved their apartment or their home, they know logistically how complicated that is and how long it takes. It could take a week, could take a month or longer, depending on how much stuff you have. So imagine how difficult it would be to move an entire hospital, especially in the middle of a war where there's people dying, people being injured, people flooding into the hospital. Imagine how difficult it would be to just pick up and move everyone. As a matter of fact, it's so obvious that this was impossible and that forcing the hospitals to move would end up killing people. It would end up directly leading to the death of almost certainly hundreds of patients being treated. And even the UN said this. So here is an article on the World Health Organization's website. Evacuation orders by Israel to hospitals in northern Gaza are a death sentence for the sick and injured. This was October 14th, 2023. It says, as the UN's agency responsible for public health, the World Health Organization strongly condemns Israel's repeated orders for the evacuation of 22 hospitals treating more than 2,000 inpatients in northern Gaza. The forced evacuation of patients and health workers will further worsen the current humanitarian and public health catastrophe. The lives of many critically ill and fragile patients hang in the balance. Those in intensive care or who rely on life support, patients undergoing hemodialysis, newborns in incubators, women with complications of pregnancy, and others all face imminent deterioration of their condition or death. They're forced to move and are cut off from life-saving medical attention while being evacuated. Health facilities in northern Gaza continue to receive an influx of injured patients and are struggling to operate beyond maximum capacity. Some patients are being treated in corridors and outdoors in surrounding streets due to a lack of hospital beds, forcing more than 2,000 patients to relocate to southern Gaza, where health facilities are already running at maximum capacity and unable to absorb a dramatic rise in the number of patients, could be tantamount to a death sentence. So already, before this hospital was bombed, Israel was already in the middle of a war crime, putting pressure on these hospitals by bombing absolutely everything around them, forcing them to evacuate, to leave, which would directly lead to the deterioration of certain patients' conditions and the death of many others. So there's that. And then remember that these evacuation orders and the bombing of this hospital took place after the Israeli government and military itself announced that they were going to conduct a bombing campaign of an indiscriminate nature. And these were the headlines even in the Western media. The Guardian: emphasis is on damage, not accuracy. Ground offensive into Gaza seems imminent. The Israeli Defense Force spokesperson, Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari, so this isn't nobody, this is a Rear Admiral and an IDF spokesperson, made the startling admission that hundreds of tons of bombs had already been dropped on the tiny strip, adding that emphasis is on damage and not on accuracy. This is an admission to carrying out an indiscriminate bombing campaign on a densely populated civilian urban area. And then a weapon capable of destruction that only Israel possesses hits a hospital, kills hundreds of patients. This unfolds. It's certainly an Israeli bombing. And beyond that, an Israeli spokesperson admitted that they did this. So let's take a look here. It was Hanaya Naftali. And I just want to show you who he is first before we look at what he says. This is his bio on the Jerusalem Post. Hanaya Naftali is a leading Israeli Jewish influencer and human rights activist in the fight against anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and the BDS movement. Naftali has been working for the former Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu as part of his digital team for the past 3 years. Naftali served in the IDF and fought Hamas terrorists during Operation Protective Edge 2014. We'll be talking about 2014 here in just a moment. And treated wounded Syrian civilians as a combat medic. I wonder if any of those Syrians might have been the ISIS militants riding around in Israeli ambulances. So this was the original tweet, which he deleted later. Let's take a look. This is a screenshot because, of course, he deleted it. This is via Going Underground. Breaking: Israeli Air Force struck a Hamas terrorist base inside a hospital in Gaza. A multiple number of terrorists are dead. It's heartbreaking that Hamas is launching rockets from hospitals, mosques, schools, and using civilians as human shields. Hashtag Hamas is ISIS. And in case you think that this tweet has been fabricated, that he never tweeted this to begin with, I want to show you a tweet from his official account. You can go check it. I will have the link to this tweet in the video description below. Here is his official account, verified account. He says, earlier today, I shared a report that was published on Reuters about the bombing at the hospital in Gaza, which falsely stated Israel struck the hospital. I mistakenly shared this information and in a since deleted post in which I referenced Hamas's routine use of hospitals to store weapons, catches, and conduct terrorist activity. I apologize for this error. As the IDF does not bomb hospitals, I assumed Israel was targeting one of the Hamas bases in Gaza. Of course, Israel most certainly does hit hospitals. It is known that Hamas is using civilians as human shields. It is a war crime and crime against humanity. This should be the focus. So he's trying to walk back his own admission that it was an Israeli strike on the hospital. He says the IDF does not bomb hospitals when in fact they do. And he's covering all of his bases by adding this last part about Hamas using civilians as human shields, just in case you don't believe him. That it wasn't the IDF. So this is an obvious war crime amid a bombing campaign that was announced and presented to the public as a campaign of war crimes, openly admitting that you're just going to indiscriminately bomb a heavily populated urban environment with mostly civilians in it. What about, from a military point of view, what is Israel doing right now at this moment? We hear about an imminent ground operation. They're preparing for it. It seems to be on hold. They're not ready for it yet. So what is it that they're doing right now by carrying out all of these bombings, also using artillery and other long-range weapons? What are they doing? This is actually what you would do in preparation for a ground operation. You would shell and bomb the area as much as possible. You would set up a perimeter around the area that you will be operating in to try to cut off the arrival of additional weapons, ammunition, and fighters. You're also preventing fighters from leaving. And then you would eventually go in on the ground after you felt you have sufficiently degraded what you could by air, by long-range strikes. Then you would go in and you would clear the area using troops, armor, but also continuing to use artillery and airstrikes as necessary. Israel is not capable of just flattening Gaza with bombs. They can seriously damage it. The problem is, even if you bomb every single building in Gaza, which Israel doesn't have enough weapons to do that, even if they wanted to, the militants that they're trying to eliminate are fortified. They have tunnels, they have bunkers. They're going to survive this. Really, the only people that are going to suffer are the civilians. Israel also cannot simply line its military up and then just steamroll over Gaza with its infantry and tanks. It really is not that simple. It's much more complicated than that. Again, I showed you that map. They're talking about just northern Gaza. Northern Gaza is about twice as big as, say, Fallujah in Iraq. That was the setting for another massive ground operation into an urban environment, led by U.S. troops. They went in, they cleared it out. They used a significant amount of military aviation and artillery, weeks of just pounding the city before they moved in. And it took over a month for them to clear the city. There were far fewer fighters there than Israel will encounter in Gaza. They were most likely less prepared. They had less time to fortify the city. They had less time to build stockpiles of ammunition, equipment, weapons that they would need to carry out an urban operation in defense against the U.S. incursion. So Israel is looking at northern Gaza. They're looking at northern Gaza. They're going to have to probably pick specific neighborhoods to isolate and clear out first. I don't think they're going to be able to encircle all of northern Gaza and then clear it that way. I think they're going to have to do it neighborhood by neighborhood. It's going to be a very brutal form of combat. We actually saw this, a little preview of this in 2014. Israel actually did go in on the ground into a neighborhood in Gaza. It was heavy fighting, and they used huge amounts of military aviation and especially artillery, something like 7,000 rounds in just a few days, which in such a small area is incredible when you think about 7,000 to 10,000 rounds fired by, say, Russia every day in Ukraine, along a very long line of contact across a much larger battlefield. And what they ended up doing was destroying everything in the neighborhood, killed huge numbers of civilians. The fighters themselves were more prepared and better protected than the civilians, who were just caught in the middle of it all. And this is what Israel is going to have to recreate. And so we're talking about a huge amount of artillery, ammunition, huge amounts of aerial ordnance. They're going to have to use armor. They will most likely lose tanks and armored personnel carriers. So what they're doing ahead of all of that is trying to hit as much as possible before they send the troops in. And that means hitting anything at all that will be useful for militants operating in Gaza, not just Hamas. There's many militant organizations there. They're going to try to eliminate anything at all that will be useful for them, which includes hospitals. They're going to get injured. They're going to need medical care. Israel would like to eliminate that as a possibility. You also read in the UN article about how Gaza's hospitals are already overloaded, and so they're hoping to divert all resources to this healthcare crisis that they are deliberately creating, and that will also divert people's time, energy, and attention away from fighting the Israeli incursion. So the difference between what Russia is doing in Ukraine and what Israel is planning to do in Gaza is that Russia has the resources to heavily shell a city for months, if not longer. They have huge numbers of troops and equipment, other long-range weapons that they can use. The cities there are in a larger country where the population can escape the fighting. You cannot do that in Gaza. The population cannot simply escape. There's either the ocean, the Mediterranean Sea, there's southern Gaza where resources are already overstretched, and then there's the borders with Egypt and Jordan, which are not open to them, because both Egypt and Jordan know that if the Palestinian population is pushed out of Gaza by Israel, Israel will never allow them to return. And under international law, that land is Palestinian. This is different than Fallujah because it's just on a much larger scale. The U.S. military, with all of its resources, all of its preparation, weeks of shelling and bombing Fallujah, still took them over a month to clear the city out. And there was a fraction of the number of fighters that Israel is going to face in just northern Gaza alone. So this is going to seriously put Israel's stockpiles and military industrial production rates to the test, as well as America's dwindling stockpiles and its already exposed inadequate military-industrial production. It is now trying to sustain fighting in Ukraine on a massive scale, and now Israel's planning a military operation that will also require a very large amount of ammunition over a long period of time. It just doesn't seem feasible. If it is feasible, they will be really cutting it close. There will be no margin for error, and there will be no margin for other contingencies that can pop up in the middle of the fighting or directly after it when the military is depleted and vulnerable. So we'll keep an eye on that. We'll keep an eye on Ukraine. Please remember the US is also attempting to stir up a conflict in the Pacific against China. I want to remind people, each time I talk about these conflicts, the US is using Ukraine as a proxy against Russia in Eastern Europe. They're using Israel as a proxy against Iran and its allies in the Middle East, which then ultimately puts pressure on southern Russia. And they want to put pressure on China in the east. And if you look at a map, you can clearly see the United States is attempting to encircle, contain, and control all of Eurasia. That is what this is about. Please don't get lost in the minutia of each conflict. There are a lot of important factors that drive people to join the fight and to make decisions in each one of these theaters of conflict. But please just remember the bigger picture and how none of this would be possible without U.S. support. Without U.S. support, Ukraine would never have even wanted to provoke this conflict with Russia. Without U.S. support, Israel would be utterly incapable of pursuing this policy of belligerence against the Palestinian people. They wouldn't have the guns to constantly resort to. They would have to resort to rational and humane diplomacy. And the same goes for Taiwan, America's proxy of choice, actually within Chinese territory. Taiwan, as it exists today, would be impossible without U.S. sponsorship for decades. So the common denominator in all three areas, all points of contention, is the U.S. and its ambitions to use these proxies against its adversaries in the region and toward a greater global policy of trying to reassert the sort of hegemony it enjoyed at the end of World War II and again at the end of the Cold War. So if you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can follow my work. I particularly suggest you follow me on Telegram. Absolutely everything goes there, including things I'm not allowed to post on YouTube or Twitter. Check the video description also for all of the links that I referenced in this video, as well as for ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize my YouTube channel. If an ad pops up, feel free to skip it. If you do want to support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon. And to everyone who has been supporting my work, whether it's month to month or through one-time donations, or even if you're just sharing my work with others, that's all greatly appreciated. That is what makes this work possible. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.